Welcome back to Man vs. Meeple, the show where we talk about all things board game related. Today we're bringing you a review of Fallout. This is based on a video game. This one's from FFG. It is a 1 to 4 player adventure in the apocalyptic possible future.
Hopefully not the possible
future.
And this one, too, like all these video games that are coming to the table, are very interesting to me and Jeremy because we play a lot of these.
Yep.
This one in particular is a huge video game franchise if you're not familiar with it. So we were really excited to see how this translates. And they did a lot of interesting things to really make it feel like Fallout.
Yeah, and talking about familiar, we're both very familiar with the franchise. We've played a lot of this game. So this is a lengthy game, Dave. It's, what, 2 to 3 hours?
2 to 3 hours for sure.
And it depends really upon the scenario. At the start, you're going to pick one of 4 different scenarios. It tells you to start with the Commonwealth, which is a basic scenario. Each of these scenarios has 2 different factions that are fighting with one another, and then you're moving your pawns around, interacting with those factions, but also trying to move your own personal agenda forward to win the game.
Yeah, I mean, largely, just like the game, this is kind of a wide open game where you can explore this map, and as small as it looks on the table right here, it really does have a sort of expansive feel. It takes a while to get across things. There's a lot of dangers and obstacles along the way. And it has a really cool narrative that you're uncovering things and discovering things and finding new missions to do and things like that. So it's really got everything that I think a Fallout fan's looking for.
So when you set up the game, you're going to pick one of these setup cards, and then on the back it tells you how to set up the game, where to place all the tiles, which ones are revealed, which ones are not revealed, and where to start with your characters. Now there's 5 different characters, but it's a 1 to 4 player game, so you have some flexibility in what you want to be. If you're familiar with the video game, you can be a Wastelander, or a Ghoul, or a Super Mutant.
Vault Dweller.
Or even a Brotherhood member.
Yep.
So you have the option of choosing what you want to be right from the start. Depending on what you choose, you're going to start with a very specific piece of equipment or ability that's specific to that player. You're also going to start with a very specific tile. Now, if you're familiar again with Fallout, there's these perk systems, and they're called special. These are like your strength and your perception, your intelligence, your luck. And each player is going to start with a very specific one, depending upon which character that you are playing. And you also have a really cool figure.
Yeah, the minis are really good.
Yeah.
Like if you're familiar with the game, even if you're not, these are really nice miniatures.
Yep. Then you're going to get a player board. Everyone has the same player board. When you look at this player board, you have a space for each of the tiles that spell out the word special. These allow you to do very specific things that interact with cards or specific pieces of equipment that you'll be getting in the game. Along the bottom, you have your health track. This is really cool.
Yeah.
On the left side, you have your
radiation.
Yeah, and on the right side, you have your health. And these will meet in the middle at some point, depending upon the tiles that you go to and how much damage you take from enemies. If they ever meet in the middle and touch each other, you die and you have to reset. Your health will always go back up to its highest value, which is 16, but your radiation will always stay where it is. So it means that the more radiation you gather through the course of the game, the harder it is to manage that because your health's going to be hitting that much sooner.
Yeah, and the cool thing about this, just like the video game, the radiation is not something you necessarily are just simply avoiding the entire game. It's not necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of things in Fallout and in this game where you're going to get a benefit, but you take radiation, and you're often put in a situation where you need to make that decision.
Yep. Also, across the very top of the board, you have 3 places for different types of tokens that you can get that give you either special abilities, well-rested things. Well, those will interact with very specific cards that will give you abilities through the course of the game. So, let's talk about all the different components. There's a lot of stuff here.
There are a lot of components. We already talked about this board. The tiles on the table, these are going to be, face down, some of them are face up at the beginning of the game. A lot of this game is going around and exploring those tiles. So you're going to discover things differently, even if you're playing the same scenario.
Yeah.
You're going to discover things differently. Things are going to play out differently every time for a variety of reasons. There's a number of tokens. Jeremy already talked about some of them. You see a giant stack of cards here. This is one of my favorite things about the game because it really builds that narrative. As you're going through the game, there are going to be events, things you discover. You're going to go searching through this to find specific cards to add either face up to the table to tell you what's going on, or you might add it into one of these other decks which is where you have to kind of go around and scavenge and explore to find those things.
Yeah, let's talk about these in depth. So how do you interact with these? On these different tiles, you have spaces that you can move to. Some of the tiles, you can just use movement spaces to get into them. Some of them are difficult terrain that show red around them. Those require 2 movements. And then some of them are green. Those are the radiated spots. But your main areas are your runes and then your supply centers, which have values to them. But you can interact with those particular areas by going to these decks and reading the cards and picking one of choices. So this is kind of a multiple choice. When you interact with one of these areas, the player to your right gets to look through this card, and when they look through this card, they're going to read the story at the top. And then they're going to give you 1, 2, 3 options, how many options are on that card, and they'll give you a value. That's something you're trying to hit with your attribute skills. And then they have consequences, either successes or failures. But the cool thing about it is you also have quests. As you go through this game, you're going to start with a very specific quest that anybody at the table can perform by doing a quest action. But also, more cards are going to filter into these encounter decks by finding specific quests or by finding specific people. So as you play different games, or even the same game multiple times, the quest line may be completely different depending upon what areas you go to and what you uncover.
Yeah, and it's really cool about the quest items, or the quest cards, is they come out and they feel like Jeremy may have rummaged through something, discovered something that started a quest. I might actually be able to complete that quest before he does. So in a multiplayer game, and you can play this game solo, which I actually think wouldn't be a terribly bad experience. It's built for that. But in a multiplayer game, people are then going to be basically fighting in a way over getting those cards completed. And most of those cards have at least 2 different ways of completing them. And usually those 2 different ways key back to the 2 different factions that are out in the scenario.
Yeah, the main differences between your quests and your encounters are your quests are face up, so everyone can see the different objectives they're trying to meet. The encounters, however, you're just guessing.
Yeah.
You may want to help the player, you may want to hurt the player, you may want to steal from the player, so you're making an obvious guess on what you wish to try to accomplish. Let's talk about some more components here. You have an asset deck. This is the shops. When you go to the shops, you can buy these cards, add them to your tableau on the bottom. On your player board, you have a spot for something to wear, for something to fight with, and then for a companion. Just like the Fallout game, you can have companions that can follow you around. And then you can hold 3 inventory items. These inventory items can be things like drugs, or magazines, or health stimulants. They can also be other weapons that you can sell off back to the shop in order to get caps. Now, again, if you played Fallout, the monetary value in this game is bottle caps, and they have bottle caps in this one. You have red and blue.
Exactly. Lastly, there are some dice here. And the dice come into play, obviously, in any game like this. You're going to have some dice rolling to determine combat. The cool thing about this one, again, if you're familiar with the game, this will make sense. These dice don't have numbers or anything like that on them. They have little Pip-Boy type characters with the different body parts highlighted, because there's a VATS system in the game where you're able to target different body parts in the video game. And this kind of recreates that a little bit, because all of the different enemies have different, this one needs to get hit in the head, this one needs to get hit in the arms, and these dice determine that. At the same time, these dice have these little star type icons, and that's the damage then you will take. So combat's very streamlined, and it all happens with these dice.
Yeah, the dice are also used for the quest, so you can have to roll a specific number of stars that can be modified by the pieces of equipment that you have and the different attributes that you may have. So one more thing I want to talk about, the perks. If you guys are familiar with Fallout, as you level up in the system, let's talk about leveling up, because it's really cool. Anytime you kill enemies in the game, you get experience for them, depending upon what level of that enemy is. Also, quests may give you experience, encounters may give you experience. Your level up is the gray dial, or the gray peg on your player board. Now, as I said, each player at the start of the game, and I am playing the Super Mutant here, will start with a very specific letter. Anytime you gain experience, you're going to move your peg to the letters that you have available from left to right. Anytime it hits back in this first spot, you gain a level. So obviously, the more letters that you have in the game, the longer it takes you to level up to get something else. Anytime you level, you randomly pick 2 more possible letters in here, and if you can choose one that you don't have, and if they're both ones that you do have, you're allowed to go through the perk deck. And this perk deck has all the different types of perks you can get in Fallout. And they have letters associated with them as well.
Yeah, the perk cards are really cool, and we can't talk about the leveling up system enough, in my opinion. I think it's the key part that really sets this game apart.
Yep.
Plus, it very much feels like the video game. You're spelling out this special word, and like Jeremy said, you can fill it up with letters. And what that does is it makes you a more versatile character, because a lot of the weapons and items that you might have may give you extra benefits if you have an L, or if you have an E, or an I, whichever letters they may be. Or you can specialize in a couple of the letters and get a lot of perks. And the perks have some very significant, like usually one-time abilities where you trade them in, you can go take an extra turn. I mean, some really significant things.
Yeah, absolutely. So how does the game structure work? On your turn, you're allowed 2 actions. There's a whole set of different actions that you can take in the game. Those are moving, exploring, fighting, encountering things in your location, finishing off a quest, and even camping. You'll have to camp through the course of the game. When you camp, you will recover 3 hit points.
Yeah.
You'll also be able to unexhaust any of your cards that you've used, because there is exhausting in this game. And then you have the ability to trade too. If you're in the same location as another player, you can freely trade anything that you have in front of you with something they may have.
And that did not come into play when we've played the game.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to see what kind of group where that would happen, because oftentimes, just like in Fallout, you never want to give up anything in this game, generally speaking.
Exactly. So once you take your 2 actions, it goes on to the next player. What are you trying to do? Like, what's the goal in the game? Now, depending upon the number of players that you have in this game, you have a certain number of agenda points that you're trying to meet. In a 1-player game, that's 11 agenda points. In a 4-player game, that's 8 agenda points. These agenda points are done by agenda cards. Everyone's going to start with one of these agenda cards, and they are kept completely secret from the other players, so you have no idea what that player may have. Each agenda card you have, no matter what card it is in this giant stack, is worth 1 point, and that's that old Fallout thumbs up that you see there. But they also provide you additional agenda points depending upon criteria that you may meet through the course of the game. You'll be able to acquire more of these agenda cards, up to 4 total, depending upon quests that you complete or encounters that you complete, and so forth.
Right. A lot of these too, like I mentioned earlier, key back to the sort of ongoing situation between the 2 factions in any given scenario. In this one, we have the Railroad and the Institute. So a lot of these agenda cards are going to suggest that you're going to get points if you've moved the Institute further down this track, or maybe move the Railroad further down this track. And like Jeremy said, they're hidden. So if I've made a big distance between the Institute and the Railroad, my agenda cards might be worth 2, 3, 4 points each. All of a sudden, I can win the game if we've made enough progress on that track.
And you can reveal that at any time once you've completed those specific agenda points. Again, as I said, it's going to go around the table. When it comes back to the first player, they have to physically draw one of the cards from the top of the remaining agenda deck. On the bottom of these cards, they tell you how creatures will move, what spaces they might move to. They're always going to move to the enemy that's closest to them, unless you're a faction that's aligned with them. Once this deck is done, that's going to signify the progress of these tokens down the board. So you're also competing against the game itself. There is a built-in timer with this deck. As it cycles through the course of the game, these tokens will move down. If they ever hit the red on that scenario sheet, everybody at the table loses, and that's something you want to kind of time out properly through the course of the game.
We didn't mention that at the beginning. This is not a cooperative game.
No, not at all.
But everyone can lose, so it is unique in that fact.
Yep. So what do you think? I mean, this isn't typically yours or my style of game.
It is not my kind of game, and I want to be cautious as we approach this, because we do have a lot of sort of fanboy nostalgia for this property.
Yeah.
That definitely plays a role in your enjoyment of this game.
Absolutely.
I think if you haven't played Fallout, it's still a very solid game in this respect. Personally, I put a lot of that on this deck right here.
Yeah.
The narrative that comes out and the missions are really, really cool. Even cooler. Basically, everything I'm about to say that's good about this game is even better if you've played Fallout.
Absolutely.
Probably by a factor of 10.
Yeah.
So I really like the game. I don't usually play these kind of games, but I find myself wanting to play this again and more. What I'm really curious about is, you said it has 4 scenarios.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how differently, we never played one scenario twice.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how different that experience is if you play the same scenario twice. if they have expansions planned for this thing, because this game is ripe for that, for sure. You could just put out more and more of these
there's
cards.
160 cards in that deck, so your chance of experiencing that in all those in one game is impossible. You're not going to. In one of our games, we probably cycled to maybe 15 of those cards out of 150 some cards.
Well, and plus, like I said earlier, those cards either have 2 or maybe even 3 branching choices.
Yeah.
So you're either making choices or you're accomplishing one of 3 objectives.
Yeah.
If you accomplish the first of 3, you're never going to see the results of the other 2 in that game. So there is kind of a big, giant flowchart, I'm sure, if you laid all these cards out that you won't see depending on how you play the game.
Yeah, this is definitely not my style of game. I'm a huge Fallout fan. I don't like dice chucking in my games, but for some reason, the dice in this game and using these dice just makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of dice mitigation depending upon the pieces of equipment that you have. For every single type of special that you may have in your sheet, depending upon the equipment, it allows you to re-roll these dice. So you can have almost infinite re-rolls trying to get the type of combination of dice that you need depending upon what pieces of equipment you have, and that's good. That's needed for a game like this that has dice rolling for both the fighting and for the encounters that you'd go through.
Right, and I like also the fact that if you haven't gotten a lot of the special letters that help you mitigate the dice rolling, then you're more likely to have picked up a lot of perks along the way. So there's no perfectly correct way to play that game or to level up. You can specialize, or you can kind of be a jack of all trades.
I also love the leveling system. Going back to that, this leveling system is really cool. Anytime you level, as we said, you're going to move up this special track, possibly adding new tiles to it or adding perks to it. The stronger you get, the harder it is to level, and that's a really cool portion about this game as well.
Yeah, it definitely recreates that sort of, as the game progresses, it's going to take longer and longer to get to that level up. I really like the status effects here. Again, there's everything you can imagine from the video game. It feels like they've covered here.
Absolutely.
As we played this game, and Jeremy taught this to the rest of us, and as he's teaching and as we're playing, the very next thing that comes up, like, here's how perks work. And I'm like, oh, that is really cool. It makes a lot of sense. And thematically, and they work that theme into the mechanics of how things work out as you play, so it really feels a lot like Fallout.
Yeah. Again, I think your guys' mileage on this game is going to vary depending upon your experience with it. I mean, if you're not a huge Fallout fan or you've never even played it, this may not appeal to you. If you are a Fallout fan, I think it's going to be a huge hit. Yeah,
and the last thing I would say, too, for people who are considering this, it is, I would say, a heavier game. There's a lot of, you're going to have to read the rules. This is not a game you can break out of the box and say, hey, everybody, let's try Fallout tonight.
Right.
Someone's going to have to read the rules pretty thoroughly. There are some things, the way the cards work off of each other and key off each other, where you need to kind of like make sure and follow the order of operations so you're doing everything correctly. That can be a little fiddly for a very new gamer or a casual gamer. So it is definitely a medium to heavier game for sure.
Cool. So that's Fallout, guys, from Fantasy Flight Games. 1 to 4 player game, takes about 2 to 3 hours, depending on the scenario that you're playing. If you guys have questions about the game, make them in the comments. Subscribe to us, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and everything else that we do. And we will catch you guys next time.
Bye-bye.
Season 2 of Man vs. Meeple is sponsored in part by Cool Stuff Inc. Cool stuff in stock at coolstuffinc.com.